Historically, the Poncas have their own story of how we came to this country. Like most tribes, they will tell you that they came from the water. In our story, the legend tells that we traveled on dry land and there was water on both sides of the area that they walked upon. When they came to this land, they camped there, and clouds had touched the ground, and where they camped, the leader of the tribe heard for the first time the Maker, our Creator, speak to them and told them that they would inherit this land. There was much to enjoy, much game, many plants. Anything that a person wanted to survive by was present in that land. And they call it Monjombaku. In other words, they took note of the entire territory, and therefore they allowed themselves to live where no one else lived. And I think that was a custom of most of the ancient peoples back in those days. The Poncas were one of the 5 tribes. We belong basically to the same linguistic family. We call ourselves a Degiha. Degiha means people on our side. And as they moved up the stream, the Osages, Quapaw, and Call Indians began to separate themselves from the main body of the tribe. The Poncas and Omahas moved up the stream further. When they came to what is now the state of Iowa, the Omahas separated from the Poncas, and the Poncas went on. There are some stories that the Poncas went on north, left the Missouri River, and went into Minnesota and ultimately into what is now Manitoba, Canada, and camped along the Red River. They came back to the pipestone quarries in Minnesota and had an encampment there. Some historians say that's where they received the sacred pipe. And they brought that back down and settled ultimately near a place which is now called Ponca, Nebraska. Ponca, Nebraska, to the Poncas was called Narrow Grave, or Michebelonze. And they lived there a long time because many people died there and they didn't want to leave them. And they moved up the stream of the Missouri and had many, many encampments all along the Missouri River to the Niobrara, up into Tripp County, which is now Tripp County in South Dakota, Todd County in South Dakota, and up to where the White River flows into the Missouri River. The Ponca had an encampment there, and also at the Wind Cave at the Black Hills and below the Black Hills, and the Twin Buttes near Winter, South Dakota, which is east of the Black Hills. The Poncas had several encampments along the Niobrara River, as well as the Elkhorn River in Nebraska. And so in this territory, which was unexplored up to the 1790s, I think there was one French trader by the name of Monnier who attempted to receive a trade agreement with the Poncas at Omaha, was denied that trade agreement because one of the authorities had a trade agreement with the Omahas and didn't want him to have that, so he said the Poncas are nothing more than Omahas, and who have left the tribe. By 1858, they had gone to Washington to protest the treatment they had received from the federal government, as they had cooperated with the government very closely. Unfortunately, things went from bad to worse. They ceded the Ponca lands to the Teton Sioux. By this time, the Poncas were reduced to a very small number, and Sioux continually attacked the Poncas. And so the government, saying that they were protecting the Poncas, decided to move them to Indian Territory. The Poncas believed that that act was done in order to appease the Sioux because they were having a lot of trouble with them. And so in 1876, they received the first word from a missionary there. And the missionary told them they were going to be moved someplace along the Kaw River in Kansas. They appropriated a little bit more money and finally said, well, you're going to Oklahoma. And so in 1877, they moved them out from Niobrara. There were 3 camps in the Niobrara era at the time, and moved these people to Baxter Springs, Kansas, and ultimately to Kay and Noble County here in Oklahoma. By the time they had arrived at Baxter Springs, there were 158 Poncas who died en route to Indian Territory. This left only a little more than 300 and some Poncas left. When they arrived here, conditions were terrible. They didn't have anything to eat. There were supposed to have been provisions given to them. But conditions were bad not only because of the provisions, lack of provisions, but also conditions were so bad because they couldn't acclimate themselves to the hot, humid country here. And they were used to the cooler climate in Nebraska. And so it was at this point that Standing Bear, in his role as a leader, as one of the leaders of the Ponca people, rose up and he said, like other leaders, they said, we have to do something about this. Well, coincidentally, his son had died, and his son had made a statement that if I should ever die, take my bones to live with our ancestors along the Niobrara River. And Standing Bear made that promise to him. And so when this issue came to head by 1879, Standing Bear said, I'm going to take my son and bury him along the Niobrara. He had 29 other people with him, including his wife and friends and relatives. And he took them back to Niobrara. But before he arrived there, he went to the Omahas. And there he spoke with them. The Omahas gave him a piece of land and said, you can farm here. Standing Bear said, okay, we'll farm here. This is where he was arrested. But he knew that was coming because a friend of theirs who had worked there with the Indian agency by the name of Webster told him, he said, I believe that the federal officers are going to come and arrest you and your families because you have illegally left Indian Territory. It happened. They came and they arrested Standing Bear and incarcerated him at Fort Omaha. There he was placed in a stockade with the rest of the members of his troop, and people came out to look at them. And they were in a very poor condition. They had walked all those miles to begin with, although they had been given some citizens' clothes, as they were called at that time. Some of them wore Indian clothes, but most of them wore modern clothing. But people in a township came out to look at them and like they were animals or whatever. But there was one man, his name was Thomas Tibbles. He was a newspaper man or a writer who had spent much time on the Missouri River all the way from Illinois across the Missouri and up to Nebraska and South Dakota. And he studied Indians, and he was known as a sympathizer to Indian people. And he came out there and he wanted to visit with Standing Bear. Of course, Standing Bear stood in the background. He wouldn't speak for himself, and he talked to some of the men folks there. And he asked him, ask Standing Bear why he is being held here. And Standing Bear made this statement, which has never been recorded. He said this way, and he said it in a Ponca language. He said, before the white man came here, if I want to go west, I can go west. Before he came here, I can go east. If I want to go north or south, I may go as I please. But since the white man has come, it seems that I can go nowhere. I don't know why I am being held here. It is against my will to be here. Well, immediately, Mr. Tibbles, who had a friend who was in Omaha, and he began to talk with him. He was an attorney, or not an attorney, but he was also a citizen who was very much interested in this whole matter. And as they began to talk, he said, well, you need to get yourself a good attorney to help him if you want to help Standing Bear. So he said there was a railroad attorney by the name of Poppleton. And he said, well, they discussed it together. How are we going to help Standing Bear? And he said, well, he made one significant statement, and that he said that he didn't know why he was being held. Now, of course, the historical record don't tell this story. This is the Ponca story that I'm interpreting to you from the Ponca language. He said, well, then maybe there are some laws that apply here that could help him. Up to then, Standing Bear had said, maybe there are two laws. One is for the white man and one is for the Indian. He said the white man can go anywhere he wants to, but for an Indian, he can't go where he wants to go. So you have two laws. This man was a very brilliant man, Mr. Poppleton, because he realized then that he was talking about some constitutional rights. That if you were a citizen of the United States, then you fell under the Constitution of the United States. Up to then, see, Indians were not considered citizens, much less. They were considered less than human. Those in modern times have described it as categorized as animals, and they were placed under the Interior Department. Now, this was said by many of the leaders in the American Indian movement in recent years. And I would say they were pretty close to being right. But the situation here is that Standing Bear, see, foreseen something here that was wrong between him and the white people, and it was a law. He said, you have a law for yourself and you have a law for us. So there must be two laws. Poppleton said that needs to be challenged. He said, if there is a difference here, he said, the Indian has never had a right, and the issue here is he a person? And if he's a person, and then he has a right under the Constitution. If not, then let the law say so. And so he began to file what he called a writ of habeas corpus. It's my layman's understanding that a writ of habeas corpus is being detained illegally. So in this case, Standing Bear filed a writ of habeas corpus, or they filed it in his behalf in that court. And so they went to court. In the process of the court proceedings, they found that, number one, Standing Bear was a very brilliant person. Secondly, he was also a Christian. Now, a lot of Indians don't want to admit that, but his entire philosophy was based upon his Christian perceptions and his ideologies. And so he told of it. They asked him what his religion was, and he told them about the Son of God. It's not any different from any sermon you might hear from any pulpit in modern times. Standing Bear also made some very profound statements. In the final statements, when he was not allowed to speak, he made a statement something like to the judge. He said, the skin on my hand is not the same color as yours. He said, but if I pierce it, he said, the blood that flows from my hand will be the same color of yours if you pierce your hand. He said, I am a man. He said, the same God made us both. I think that was very dramatic in that court. And A.J. Poppleton stood there, they said, and he couldn't say a word. Here was the attorney who was supposed to be speaking for him. And the judge took those words and he began to ponder it. Certainly, this man has to be a man like us. So he came back with his decision, and he said this in the finality of the court proceedings. He said, an Indian is a person and was entitled to all rights under the Constitution of the United States. That law, that right applied not only to Standing Bear and to the Ponca people, but it applied to every tribe of Indians across the United States. That law went into effect that day in 1879. So Standing Bear has been considered the first civil rights leader by most historians today. He never picked up a gun to fight the white man, but I guess it could be said indirectly, he picked up a law book and said, I'll fight you in your own court of law, and I want the laws to be the same for all men.